Boldwood presents The Soul Killer, a D.I. Barton investigation, written by Ross Greenwood and read by David Thorpe. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Repent in this life, rejoice in the next. Chapter 1. The Soul Killer. My earliest memory is from my reception year at school when I was 5. That was 25 years ago. It was the day we broke up for Easter. Many people's first recollections are dramatic or bad. Perhaps that's why they stick in the mind, but it's not the pain that remains vivid all these years later. It's the shock and confusion. I simply didn't understand. However, I believe that was the moment I realised I might be capable of murder. My mother picked me up from school and we marched back together. We never held hands, but we talked. Well, she talked. The air of tension around her was already present. It matched the stark streets where we lived. She asked what I'd done that day. My eyes watered with the cold wind as I struggled to remember. When we reached home and entered the narrow kitchen, I opened my satchel and stared at the small Easter basket that I'd made. I stroked the shiny surface of the foil egg, knowing on some level I should keep it hidden. "What's that in there?" she said. Guile is beyond most young children, and I was no different, so I closed my bag. "Give it to me." She grabbed the handles, removed the little cardboard box and held it as though it might detonate. "I made that," I said. "I warned the school about this sort of thing. They'll regret not listening to me." I didn't see her point, and I was desperate to have the basket. "Can you give it back to me, please?" "It's confiscated." I remember thinking that I owned it. I'd built it using cardboard and foil with the other boys and girls in the classroom. The sense of excitement in the air as we had queued to leave that afternoon had prickled my skin. The teacher had helped me with my coat and wished me Happy Easter, but although I had heard the phrase many times in lessons, the idea of Easter being happy confused me. Easter, when mentioned at home, was said with solemn awe and triggered fear in me. There was no talk of chocolate and Cadbury's cream eggs. I knew not to upset my mother. She never shouted, but I would receive a look, one that warned me of impending discipline, which would stay on her face sometimes for days before I received my penance. My brain hunted for something to say. "It's for a joyful Easter." She stopped in the doorway. I'd heard the word joy many times at church, but her reply was a growl. "We do not celebrate it in that way. Don't let me hear you mention it again." "Why not? I want to be happy. I want to be like other children." Back then, I hadn't learned the value of silence. I also hadn't learned that I wasn't like other children. Only my father was relatively normal in our house. She returned to stand in front of me. Her ageless brown shirt and jacket, combined with severely pulled back greying hair, made her seem featureless, despite the large glasses she wore. Perhaps these enabled her to see sin more clearly. Through these, her piercing light blue eyes stared down and, with total certainty, she made things abundantly clear. "God does not approve of that. It's for pagans. We are pure." At that moment, I decided I'd be a pagan, and I still wanted what I made. A flash of pure rage swept through me, I believe for the first time. My foot lashed out, and I kicked her in the shin. Quiet seconds followed. It's hard to remember if she smiled or grimaced. Whatever, I cowered to my knees and wrapped my hands around her thick tights. She kicked my arms away. "Wait there," she said. The anticipation is worse than actual physical pain, which only really hurts for a while. I'd experienced the impact of rolled-up newspapers and cooking spoons on many occasions, and so my mind had stopped imagining the worst because I thought I'd seen and felt it all. I didn't know about the cellar. As she seized my jumper at the back collar and dragged me past my father in the dining room, I noticed someone had moved the dinner table. A trapdoor yawned open. Wide-eyed, I implored him to save me as he rose from his seat. "You go too far, Marjorie." After a final glance at me, he left the room and strode out of the house. He might have returned to get his things at some point, but I never saw him again. When I look back, I remember hints of happiness and positivity, but he had retreated from us, like an ever-so-gradual cloud drawing over the sun. The eclipse came that day. I stared down into the abyss. There were no steps, only blackness. She shoved me hard and firm in the back, and in I dropped, landing on a thin mattress. I gasped in agony as my knees compressed the material and jarred on the floor. Inside, I could just make out the contours. The space was about 2 meters high and wide. I slumped onto my side and, with an outstretched, grasping hand, pleaded for her to pull me up. She loomed above me, so large and powerful. Her voice boomed down. "Repent in this life, rejoice in the next." Her words meant nothing. She was always boring me about one thing or another. I glanced around with blurred eyes as she dropped the trapdoor in place. The only other items I could see before complete darkness enveloped me were a pair of my father's shoes and a blanket. Had he been down here too? I knelt in the chilled space and imagined the walls pressing in. I believe any other child, whatever their age, would have screamed, but I did not. It makes me think I've always been different. I reached for the blanket and kept silent while listening to the sounds of the table scraping back into place. Sitting in the dark, I focused on how I could recover my basket. I wasn't fully aware of my intentions at that moment. The only sound in my prison was the rhythmic ticking above of my mother's pendulum clock. It was a noise to go mad to. Recalling my thoughts is difficult. My whole body tensed. I stifled the scream that yearned to erupt, knowing my mother would recognize its fury when she craved to hear fear. After a while, I unclenched my jaw and rolled my shoulders. A surprising emptiness washed over me, leaving only a cold, controlled motivation. That focus made me understand for the first time that I was capable of anything. Chapter 2. The Soul Killer. I've no idea how long I waited down there that first time. No more than a few hours, probably. Using spaced hands in the pitch black, I checked the floor for other objects, but found myself in an empty square except for my father's things. I sat and thought about my actions, and accepted the truth. Mother made the rules, and I had disobeyed them. Kicking her was just plain dumb. 5-year-olds might be inexperienced, but they aren't necessarily stupid. I knew from then on that if I wanted special things, I'd need to keep secrets. She would have to be obeyed, or at the very least think she was. The table scraped the floor, and the trapdoor creaked open. The light above stung my eyes. Judging eyes scrutinized me, but she remained silent. "Sorry, I won't do that again," I said. She nodded. She knelt and held out her hand. I was always strong. Jumping up, I pulled myself out and found dinner set for 2. Already the place appeared drabber without my father. He had been working away much more of late, staying in hotels or leaving early. I could tell my mother missed him too because her eyes strayed to his seat. So he ate in silence, except for that clock. Eventually, I had to ask the most important question a child will ever need to know, words they should never need to speak. "Do you love me, Mother?" She opened her mouth and closed it without saying anything. Finally, she spoke as though reading from the good book, but she looked unconvincing. "God's love is all you require." There was no television in our house, but I had jobs to keep me busy. Later, if I'd worked hard, she treated me to biscuits and milk. Then she'd follow me up the stairs and tuck me into bed. Each night we read a story about years gone by. My favourite was always the tale of David and Goliath. Afterwards, we'd stare at each other, and I'd smile as though I understood the message she was trying to impart. The Bible stories she read seemed contradictory to me. Some taught to turn the other cheek, whereas others seemed to condone slaughtering at will. Few suffered damnation for their sins. God forgave most, but he could be the cruelest of all. Sometimes I'd see a half smile, as though she wanted to connect. I believe she loved me at that point, and I can't blame her for everything. This world sickens and corrupts, and it drove her madder. Loss can make you ruthless. I don't think I responded to her in the way she hoped. My problem, to others, is that I'm unfeeling. I have a narrow range of emotional responses. Little bothers me or excites me. It's why I'm good at my job. The strange antics in my house might have unsettled another child, but I just got on with it. Perhaps she wanted me begging for warmth. As time marched on, my mother changed. She'd stare at my father's picture, occasionally running a finger down the frame. I knew to escape the room, or I would be blamed for his absence. Sometimes she'd holler that I'd cost her a soulmate. When I was 10, a solicitor came to our home, but my mother refused to let him in. I was sitting on the lounge floor doing a jigsaw and heard him report that my father had died after a heart attack. His new partner had instructed him to inform us. My mother said he was dead to her the day he left, and she closed the door. After he'd gone, I studied her. That was a lie. She had looked high and low for him. Many a time I put myself to bed and woke up to a cold breakfast in an empty house. She caught my appraising glance. I rose to leave, expecting harsh words and blame. Instead, tears streamed down her cheeks. I'd never seen so many before, not even in my own mirror. I stood next to her. Only the steam from our hot breath meeting in the cold air of our lounge. I raised my hands but didn't know where to place them. Her fingers flexed too, but also remained at her sides. "Don't do what I've done," she said. I shook my head in confusion. "I lost everything. He was my better half and the joy in my heart. It would have been better if he had died with me rather than have him escape." She blinked a couple of times at my shocked face and frozen open mouth. "But what about me?" I said. "Don't make the mistakes I did. I will teach you the way of this world. God has given me a burden to carry. I must bear it." With that, she took care not to touch me as she left the room. 500 kids attended my senior school. There were naughtier ones than me and others who had it worse. I perfected hiding from attention there and at home. I told neither place about the other. My mother's threats of homeschooling were enough to make me conform. I'd recovered my Easter basket from the outside bin after the first basement incident. I kept it in a cardboard box hidden on the top shelf at the back of my wardrobe. Over the following years, I gently placed inside it the other things that my mother disapproved of. But I was to discover that I had chosen a poor hiding place, and it would alter the course of my life. A boy at school had been bothering me, a short lad called Jimmy. He wasn't usually violent, only quick and smart. Every opportunity he had, he belittled me, and I couldn't cope with his intelligent humour. The other kids laughed at his put-downs, not realising how much they hurt me. I learned to keep quiet and stay away from him. Jokes ranged from my voice cracking in class to the musty smell I carried. Even the teacher chuckled. It was hard to live in such a powerless vacuum. I coped by showing no emotion, but there are those who notice such insignificance. Once, 3 much older boys grabbed me as I left the school library. 2 held my hands out as the third pretended to punch me in the face, only stopping when his fist was an inch from my nose. Jimmy happened to wander by, and they told him to thump me. He looked more scared than me. My nose bled afterwards, but he could have hit me much harder. I dawdled home, but my mother took the shirt off me and soaked it in water. She knelt to my level, and her harsh breath drove home a lesson. He is watching. Their punishment will be just. Jimmy once slipped down some stairs while running at school. While others jeered, I rushed to help him up. The Bible usually taught you to forgive. We had a moment where he softened, and he even gave me a smile. The others noticed the moment and stayed quiet. I beamed for the rest of the afternoon. But my reprieve lasted for just one day before the taunts continued. Life taught me different lessons. Luckily, he moved school after the first year, but it was as though he had infected me with a virus. No one came too close. My confidence plummeted further. It made me long to be invisible, in case the others like him noticed me. My mother and I visited many places of worship over the years. A few at the start were happy-clappy, but they became more sombre. One even made me consider that the world was doomed and that I was partly responsible. Most expected you to attend in your smartest clothes, yet a couple had all manner of beggars inside. We attended huge churches and had candle mass in people's lounges. I sat wide-eyed and scratching my head at almost every denomination people worshipped. We even dabbled in religions where the congregation prayed to humans with animal heads. Strangely, those beliefs made most sense to me. I realised that there were 2 consistent things about all of them. They all believed that life carried on after we died. Some talked about being reborn as something else, while most dangled the lure of everlasting life in heaven. Ascending there to be judged as worthy by him should be your aim. The second thing was that my mother didn't fit in. Her views often didn't align with any of the people who attended these churches, even the nice ones. It took a while for me to conclude that her opinions wavered to suit her mood. Whatever she searched for in these places remained elusive. After my father left, she rarely sang. Instead, she'd stare at the altar with grim conviction. She used to attend confession. Afterwards, as she drove home, she would whisper to herself the same lines over and over. I know that I am saved. I am born again. I am a child of God. Confession stopped when she decided she knew better than those giving out the advice. Not everyone agreed with her views on eternal damnation. She believed that only a special few would be spared the wrath of God. The criteria to qualify were a shifting sand that I struggled to get my head around. More than once I found myself considering the kitchen table and what lay beneath. She'd shake me and explain that good people sometimes had to do bad things that would save their souls and banish others into permanent darkness. Occasionally, she'd shoot out of her seat and bellow at the pulpit, and we'd have to leave mid-service, or I'd be hauled from Sunday school. She'd tell me on the way home about the brutality of life and how everyone had their own interests at heart. She'd stop in the street and lean down to look in my eyes. We don't need them in our lives. Only those who are saved are worth anything. I was having a good time. We don't worship to have a good time. Our goal is heaven and life everlasting. Are we going there? Yes. With Father. Her grip tightened, and I was dragged along. Of course. I wondered what his last girlfriend would think about that. Whatever, it was serious stuff when I'd rather have been reading comics. She always said not to worry about this life because happiness existed a final heartbeat away. When someone maddens over years, it's hard to see the exact point when they become crazy, as opposed to just different from the rest of us. Mother was lucid then, but with my father gone, little outside influence crept within our walls. The gospel according to Marjorie held sway, and I was destined to be her disciple. At age 12, I was plunged through the trapdoor for the final time. She had burst into my room and found me enthusiastically exploring my puberty. My cheeks still burn when I recall that frozen second. For a long while, I thought of her whenever I became aroused. I wonder if I ever truly got over it. At that embarrassing moment, she screamed at me, "What do you think you're doing in my pure house?" I assumed correctly that she didn't want the actual answer. I fumbled for my clothes. Even though our heights matched by then, her determination overpowered me. She grabbed my ear and pulled me down our dangerously steep stairs. I almost tripped and plummeted down while trying to cover myself up. I stood with my hands between my legs as she dragged the table back and lifted the rug. Again, she thrust me in from behind. I didn't reach for help, nor feel the cold. I only scowled into the darkness. Chapter 3. The Soul Killer. My relationship with my mother changed after that incident. She left me down there until darkness fell, at least 10 hours. When the trapdoor lifted, I returned her glare until she stepped away. I climbed out to an empty room. She never mentioned what had happened, her part in it or mine. I don't recall her touching me again, in punishment or in love. I continued my education but tried to remain unseen and was mostly successful, although Jimmy's acquaintances still bullied me. Their nicknames stuck throughout the years. Even now, if I hear the words mentioned, my body tenses. That said, some people started to include me, and I slowly made some friends. I even joined the cross-country team and excelled. It suited my nature to run ahead where no one could bother me. My mother didn't insist I earn money to contribute to the household finances, but there were no free rides. Conversation and story time ended. Instead, washing and ironing the family's clothes became my job. It took a year until I got the hang of it and stopped burning my hands and ruining things. I never minded the pain. I impressed the teachers with my exam results and told my mother I wanted to go to university. She left me gobsmacked by telling me God expects us to seek knowledge. Perhaps she wanted to see the back of me. I think she had become confused as to the point of life. Cleanliness used to be next to godliness, but mould crept into the corners of the rooms and surfaces gathered dust. By that time, Barney Trimble, her new partner, had been with us for a while. He was a dopey sort, with a beaten expression, and the type of guy who you could see every day for years but never recall any details about him. He spent most of his time in my father's chair. The similarities in looks were so strong, even down to the side parting that showed a glistening head, that I imagined he had been grown in a test tube for the role, but errors had crept in. He had very few opinions of his own and was not dissimilar to a quiet dog. But their relationship was different. Muffled groans of violence escaped from their room at night. I contemplated investigating, but many of the howls were his. He stayed, though, so perhaps he had nowhere else to go. Barney owned a white and black camper van, a real plus point. Of course, my mother believed it ungodly. She considered it some kind of sex wagon. But Barney and I took numerous weekend trips to a peaceful place called West Runton in Norfolk. We didn't speak much to each other the whole time, but instead we relaxed in the peace and quiet away from Mother's sermons. He worked an allotment too, where he spent many hours. I don't know what he grew there, because he rarely brought anything home. I once pulled his leg about his name almost being Barney Rubble. A playful smile lit up his face for a second, an expression I only saw on a few occasions. He told me that his friends called him Flintstone at school. It seemed weird to think of him in that way, a person with a life and a future, when he ended up such a non-entity. But I liked that he had told me that. Cambridge University disorientated me at first. I could barely cope with the people and noise. The halls of residence sometimes reminded me of the first day of the January sales, and I kept my room away from the noise and purpose. However, I slowly realised that, despite the throng, there was an anonymity to the place. Busy people missed the silent soul among the thousands. I accepted a job at a bakery to pay my way. An old guy and I arrived at 5 and baked for when the store opened. We left when the other staff turned up. Then I attended my lectures. I kept up with my running. Another jogger from the athletics club took a shine to me. Charlie wasn't a particularly nice person and became a nightmare when drunk, but we became some sort of couple. I think she enjoyed bossing around the club's fastest runner. The coach encouraged me to attend national tryouts, but I sought no glory. Then a strange thing happened. Christmas came. You could sense the change in mood over everyone and everything. Trees and tinsel appeared. A palpable buzz grew as the big day approached. I'd avoided the fresher parties. People were more in your face under the influence of alcohol. But I succumbed to the end-of-year Christmas bash. Charlie's family were rich. She bought me a tuxedo and I felt like James Bond. It was heady. She suggested I cut my hair short and called me Action Man, and I liked it. The figure of him she bought as a joke even had the same expression I wore when I ran. Her beauty reflected well against my cool distance. It brought us status. Nice clothes brought me compliments. To my amazement, the party flew by. Everyone seemed to want to talk with me and listened when I spoke. They interpreted my standoffishness and distance as drive. Many stopped and explained that they respected my commitment. They admired my focus on running at the crack of dawn. They were unaware I was running to work. Sometimes I'd put my trainers on and disappear late at night. Exercise, silence the voices, the ones telling me I didn't belong. But with Charlie by my side, I fitted in, and she resembled a movie star that night. I basked in the reflective glow. Later, she dragged me back to her room. Fuck me hard. Rank, brandy breath wrinkled my nose. I gulped, not having had sex at that point. Buttons popped as she tore the shirt from my back. Sharp nails scraped down my chest. It hurt, but the intensity was intoxicating. Perhaps that was the appeal for Barney with my mother. I had never felt so alive. She pushed me onto the bed and straddled me. God, yes, my thoughts strayed to my mother. Screw me, Charlie demanded, frantic eyes boring into mine. Her language shocked me more than the naked proximity of our bodies. That was what dragged my mind into the present and made me respond to her requests. As a person, Charlie was shallow, but as a teacher, she was very effective. I wasn't completely naive. I had seen porn before, but I followed her instructions. I enjoyed the workout. The power I possessed over her during certain moments pleased me more than the climax itself. I owned her. Those occasions with Charlie showed me that by training my body and focusing on a woman's needs, I could become something else. For the first time in my life, I felt I belonged in a way that I previously hadn't. I had become a participant as opposed to an observer. For the last few weeks up to Christmas, the world and I were synchronized. I relaxed and looked others in the eye. I enjoyed the simple pleasures of hot chocolate in front of a pub fire and buying gifts to place next to a tree. Until one day, towards the end of term, early in the morning when I left for work, I froze as I caught one of our senior lecturers sneaking out of Charlie's room. Chapter 4. The Soul Killer. I followed him out to the exit and scowled as he cycled away on his rickety bicycle. I followed at a distance, which wasn't hard. He didn't go far, only back to one of the buildings that was near to the university. Perhaps his home came with the job. Afterwards, I sprinted through the streets, but I was unable to still my mind. Anger bubbled at the periphery of my thoughts, but initially it wasn't aimed specifically at her or him, even. After all, we hadn't made a commitment to each other. She had been more like a training buddy. But I knew I'd missed the recent feeling of involvement, of being part of something. As I finally tired, I saw that they'd disrespected me. How dared they? Was I nothing? Would my university life mirror my school life? All these years I had turned the other cheek to my mother, to bullies, to all. It had gained me nothing. Finally, I headed to work, happy in the knowledge that, if necessary, I knew where he lived. That night, I returned to the lecturer's house and stood waiting under a tree in the distance as it rained. When he returned home, he kissed a middle-aged woman at the door and retreated into a cosy glow. The truth of the matter became even clearer to me in the run-up to Christmas Day. Having a beautiful partner had grounded me and made others look at me in a new light. Charlie wouldn't figure in my future. However, I was sure such a girl did exist, I would train, get my degree and find a good job until we met. Then I'd hang on to her and live the perfect life. Nobody and nothing would come between us. It would be us against the world to the end of the world. Luckily, I hadn't given Charlie the necklace I'd bought for her. I decided to give it to my mother instead. It would be a secret acknowledgement that I wouldn't lose my soulmate when I found her, as my mother did when she let my father slip through her fingers. I returned to Wisbeach late on Christmas Eve to a silent home, regretfully with no place else to go. Obviously, there was no wreath on the door. Inside it was so dark, cold and still that it oppressed all life. Even the clock seemed to struggle to tick. I knew I'd have no presents again. My room remained the same, and I crept up the stairs so as not to wake anyone and slipped under the duvet. I imagined the black mould on the walls rapidly expanding, covering them completely and then engulfing me. Stealing from the bed, I turned on the light and took some deep breaths. Gentle snoring came from the landing. I walked towards their room and stood next to the bed. My mother looked frailer than I recalled. My eyes scanned the room for personal items, but there was nothing. I realised she had chosen this non-life. It was up to me to choose something different. The following morning I came downstairs in a mischievous mood. My mother and Barney ate cereal in silence, and the overriding impression I had was of grey lives. Their days were featureless landscapes where breathing was automatic, but actually living was not. What was the point to it all? Even if you were focused on the next life, couldn't you do something in this one while you waited? I was determined to. I planned for a life full of drama and excitement. I had laughed the first time someone called an old people's home God's waiting room, but that was where my mother spent her days. Imagine wasting your entire existence with one foot in the grave. Why not live before you die? You can take risks, do what you like. In fact, if you believe in the safety net of heaven, then eternal happiness is yours, even if you make the ultimate mistake. What a perfect truth! If life is a game, play it with purpose and enthusiasm. At least try to enjoy it. "Merry Christmas," I said. I received a grin from Barney. My mother stopped chewing. I gazed around the Spartan room. I knew I shouldn't give her the necklace, but I thought of everything I'd missed out on in my life. The people I had left at college were elated, laughing and boisterous in anticipation of Christmas, ensuring the drabness of my childhood became blisteringly evident. I had returned to a scene from a Charles Dickens story. "Here you go, Mum." She hated that word. "This is for you." I reckoned on her throwing it straight in the bin, and my mouth dried as she took her time with the unwrapping. Barney slowly placed a spoon on the table as though he were a Western gunfighter lowering his pistol for the sheriff. There was just the dreaded tick from that infernal clock as she opened the box and stared inside. I sometimes kid myself that I saw tears. If they were present, she'd been blinded by wrath. I was surprised the clock didn't blow up with the tension. She eased the box lid shut and hurled it in my direction. Somehow I caught it one-handed. Her righteous sneer still triggered a tremble in my legs. I backed away and clambered up the stairs. A few seconds later, a step behind me creaked. The urge to flee overwhelmed me, but I had only my bedroom ahead. She followed me and stopped at the door. "Where are you going with that? It cannot stay in this house." Without thinking, I looked at the wardrobe, which held the collection of my possessions, and I knew immediately where the necklace belonged. It also dawned on me that she couldn't hurt me anymore. Her punishments were over, her power gone. She might own this house, but I could take my belongings and use my wages if she threw me out. My serene face must have betrayed my intentions, because suddenly the doorway dwarfed her. Perhaps only then did I see her clearly. "Looking for your stash, son? Your horrible little things are gone." Blood rushed in my ears as I yanked the wardrobe door open and searched for my secrets. With relief, I spotted the box in its normal place, but it was too light when I picked it up. Placing the necklace inside the empty space, I turned with a smile. My mother retreated from my expression. She understood at that moment what her nurturing skills had created. As she stepped down the first stair, I returned to her the hearty shoves she had bestowed on me, backed by decades of interest. It's no lie to say, she flew. Those stairs were steep. She made no sound until there was an almighty wooden crack as she hit the bottom. It could have been a floorboard or her neck. Death was instantaneous, judging by the direction of her stare. A falling body makes a shocking clump, and Barney ran to investigate. That was the strangest thing about the whole experience. Barney rang for an ambulance in the same casual manner as one orders a taxi. We didn't speak until the sirens sounded. I've been telling her to put a rail on those stairs for years. I'll sort it tomorrow. Did he suspect I pushed her? My mother was a strange woman. It made sense that she would have unusual friends. I listened to Barney inform the police about the terrible accident and explain that I'd been in my room. Our matter-of-fact responses must have been convincing. I think it's normal to be stunned by such an abrupt end to a life. The police weren't daft. Many a disagreement finishes at the bottom of a flight of stairs. The sergeant directed his questions at me. Did you argue? Was she upset? Not at all. She seemed exactly the same as always. His stare almost disarmed me, like my mother's. He glanced at my scruffy college clothes and smiled. I know what students are like. Did you come back at Christmas and get drunk with your friends? It's easy to argue at this time of the year. The holidays can literally be murder. Clever guy. It was like a game. Who's the cleverest? Not in our house, sir. We don't celebrate Christmas. I gestured to our bare walls. The paramedic approached and checked me over. I recall her warm and gentle hands, motivated by more than just doing her job. She enjoyed her role. It was her vocation, and I thought one day perhaps I would relish a career I could love. I wanted to excel at something and be known for it. Once they removed the body and everyone had left, Barney and I sat together. I struggled to find suitable words. Probing into whether or not he'd intentionally lied to the police didn't seem wise. I'd also had an epiphany. My life would be different now I understood the world, but a few things remained unclear. Barney, why did you stay with her? She can't have been easy to live with. He shrugged and his eyes rose to the ceiling and their bedroom above. We connected, if you know what I mean. I wanted to marry her, but she despised what she called pagan rituals. Her words. I suppose I have weird taste in women. Couldn't you have found someone a little more normal? He slumped onto his seat and exhaled loudly. There's little difference between despair and defeat. He pulled his t-shirt down to cover his pot belly and ran a hand through his lank, thinning hair. There wasn't a queue forming. I'd only gone to church because I was lonely. I knew she was looking for a replacement for your father, and I never filled the role, but we had a life of sorts. Although I found a drawer full of their things, old photos of them together, jewellery, even an old letter that I couldn't bring myself to read. I never mentioned it to her because sometimes she'd cling to me at night and it was good. Certainly better than being alone. She cooked for me and washed my clothes. It was company. I had our trips in the van to look forward to, and I enjoyed the allotment. It's been okay. You didn't mind being second choice? Not if the alternative is coming in last. She treated me well enough. It was an interesting insight. Some people lead unexciting lives, but they aren't necessarily unhappy. Barney looked serious for a moment. He spoke slowly. It was you who I worried about. How so? Your mother had some strange ideas and views. She was always preaching to you, and some of what she said was dark. I tended to ignore most of what she said. Yes, I know, but you listened more as you got older. Is that so bad? It depends. If you're told the same thing over and over again, it can eventually sink in, even if it first sounded wrong. Before I had time to consider his words, he changed the subject. Anyway, she loved you. Of that I'm sure. She treated me badly. He reached over and patted my hand. Your mum struggled with affection and love. Were you aware she went to a convent school? No. She never mentioned it. It was extremely religious and very strict. I think they punish the children in ways that are unacceptable now. That affected and influenced her, and, she enjoyed some unnatural things. I don't think she knew how to respond to authority or religion after that, nor how to be a good parent. She was completely convinced that this life was for suffering, so that you could receive heaven as your reward. They'll take care of her there. I found myself whispering Amen, but my eyes rose to the ceiling too. I wished I hadn't asked, because I struggled to look him in the eye for a long time after that, even though he had done me a huge favour. As I grew older, I understood that you hold on to someone you belong with, whatever the consequences or however hard it becomes. But you protect your soul, even if that means breaking the law. Barney gave me his debit card and PIN and sent me down to the corner shop for a turkey, just like in A Christmas Carol, except I only found Bernard Matthews chicken slices. It was run by a Sikh shopkeeper who opened for a few hours for others who didn't celebrate the day. I bought a bottle of whiskey, some beers, and a few bags of crisps as accompaniments. When I returned, Barney had put the radio on, and we listened to various songs intermingled with Christmas classics. We ate a Chinese takeaway later. All in all, I enjoyed a pleasant day. Just before we retired, Barney handed me a plastic bag. Your mother put it in the loft this morning. I like to think she would have returned it to you, instead of throwing it away. Opening the bag, I revealed the contents of my secret box. I considered the motivation for what I had done and shrugged. There were few regrets, because my mother, who never fitted into this world, was now at peace. What I did was hardly a crime. Hadn't I delivered her to where she wanted to be? Her mortal worries were over now, and her soul was free. Chapter 5. D.I. Barton. The Funeral. Detective Inspector John Barton began to surface from a dream-filled sleep. His mount had just jumped the last fence and galloped up the home straight in the Grand National to cheering from the heaving crowds. The images faded to the presentation ceremony where the giant trophy loomed before him. "Here you are, John. Now get moving or you'll be late." He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and focused on the cup in front of him. It said, "Anybody who says the police are corrupt can kiss my Rolex." His wife, Holly, scowled at him. His head dropped back on the pillow as though full of cement. "Oh, do I have to go?" "Everyone's expecting you. I don't understand what's got into you lately." He watched her leave in a sombre suit and admired the tight but sensible trousers. Was that an acceptable thought to have on such a sad day? He considered her words and agreed. He didn't know what had got into him lately either. The death of his colleague, Alan Ginger Rogers, had shocked him to the core. But other worries trickled into his mind too. Besides, there probably wasn't a single person in the city that the acts of the snow killer hadn't affected. As a policeman, he always assumed he could cope with anything. He knew that his team would look to him for guidance over the next few months. An officer killed in the line of duty would drag down morale. He'd have the tough task of reminding them they had a job to do, however brutal the murder of one of their own was. The coroner had released the bodies over a week before, and after a month, the shock of his colleague's demise had lessened, but the gloom remained. Ginger had no close family, and when no distant relative or friend had stepped forward to organise the funeral, in the end, Barton's wife had said she'd do it. That was Holly to a T, and was one of the reasons why he loved her. She had tolerated Ginger's friendship with Barton. Ginger had enjoyed a joke and a drink, so most partners had considered him an all-round bad influence. They had double-dated with Ginger and his long-term girlfriend in the distant past after Ginger's second divorce, but the Bartons had ended up with 3 children, and John had been promoted. Life had changed for them and their other couple friends as they had aged and their families had grown, but no one had told Ginger. When Holly had finally reached his partner to ask her views on the funeral arrangements, Debbie had explained that they split up years ago. Ginger hadn't said a word to anyone. Holly and Debbie had chosen a simple service by a celebrant instead of a religious figure. After all, Ginger's only spirituality had come in a bottle. Barton heaved himself out of bed and gazed into the mirror with a smile. At well over 6 feet tall and 18 stone, he'd make an unlikely jockey. It would need to be some horse. Nevertheless, his colourful dreams contrasted with the dark thoughts that circled him during daylight. His mother had told him that his father had suffered from depression, so, by acknowledging the risk, Barton hoped it wouldn't become a problem. By the time he clomped down the stairs in his dark grey suit, Holly was at the door with her arms crossed. Barton smiled, but a cracking came from under his foot. He stared down at his 5-year-old son's lorry that now resembled a Ferrari. "Lock up. I'll drive. We'll go in my car," she ordered, shaking her head. The kids were at school. Only the 15-year-old Lawrence remembered Ginger, and he hadn't seen him for a long time. Barton had overheard Lawrence asking Holly questions concerning the recent killings. She had given him the same explanation as Barton had. Sometimes sick people got angry and lashed out. He stepped outside and grimaced at Holly's tiny car. While he waited for her to unlock the door, he glanced around at the area where the snow killer had operated. There was an oppressive feel to the air, as though there were too many big white clouds for the sky and they'd tumbled towards the earth. Perfect funeral weather, he mused. Even the wind didn't know what to do. Winter was over, but no one had told spring to arrive. Perhaps it was waiting until they'd buried his friend. Barton squeezed in next to his wife. "Don't you think my car would be more comfortable?" She couldn't help a smile sneaking onto her face. "I didn't know if you'd still be over the limit." "I only had 4 beers last night. It's hard for me to keep up, what with you drinking every evening." Barton kept his mouth shut. Management had allowed him a week off after the end of the serial killer case. When he had returned, he'd found himself distracted by things that had never bothered him before. It made him unfocused and forgetful during the day, and with gathering gloom, he struggled to drop off at night. A couple of cold ones helped with that. In the past, he had confided in Holly when the brutal nature of policing had threatened to swamp him. He grasped at that moment that he had stopped doing so. "It's the job. I thought you said it was slow. Not present work." She studied his face as she pulled up at some traffic lights. They would arrive at the crematorium in minutes. He waited while she decided whether or not it was the time to delve into a deep conversation which they might not be able to finish. She concluded it wasn't. "Don't exclude me, John. We'll get through this together." "I know. It's just my brain processing things." "Don't worry," she said with a grin. "Peterborough rarely gets a serial killer. We should have plenty of time before the next one." Chapter 6. D.I. Barton. Holly's forehead creased as she drove in circles around the full parking bays at the crematorium. Despite her fretting, they had still arrived 10 minutes before the start. Barton spotted D.S. Kelly Strange and D.S. Sean Zander laughing at him in the little car as they did loops, hoping for a space to come free. They eventually parked on a grass verge near the entrance. Zander opened the door for Barton. Before he could struggle out, Zander crouched and waved at Holly. "Will Madam need the toolbox to get this creature out of the passenger seat?" "Hi, Sean. You okay? He pops out if I tickle him." Barton shook his head. Everyone on the planet called Sean Zander plain Zander, except Holly. Zander had lost his son over a year ago through CO2 poisoning. His marriage disintegrated in the aftermath, so Holly often asked him and invited him around, with little success. Zander had finally emerged on the other side of his pain, but experiences like that darken you forever. He was big, similar in height and proportion to Barton, but grief had stolen his appetite. Barton used to compare him to Muhammad Ali due to his rapid banter. He regretted the loss of humanity in his friend, but who could blame him? A large hand hauled Barton out. They stood next to each other and smiled. The case of the snow killer, Zander's loss, and years of working together had strengthened their bond. "I'd prefer it if you two made out after the funeral, lads," said D.S. Strange. Barton chuckled. Strange hadn't been out of hospital long, and he had kept away from her house so she could get her head sorted. He'd learned that she preferred to process life's blows alone. Strange reached over and gave his hand a meaty shake. She punched Zander on the arm. Barton suspected romantic tension between them, but it was just a detective's hunch. They were the linchpins of his team, even though she had only transferred up from London last year. Strange had tolerated some bullying in the capital, and this had given her a tough edge. She was perfect sergeant material. In the short time she had worked in the department, she had provided valuable insight on many occasions. Her serious nature discouraged most from flirting, and Barton admired her sparks of genius. The impressive efficiency and resourcefulness of Barton's unit had remained the only positive to come from the shocking murders. The Snow Killer's end had resulted in a devastating loss for Strange, too. Ginger had saved her life by sacrificing his own. However, the trauma had caused her to miscarry. Events like these recent ones could rip a team to shreds if officers concentrated on the price they might have to pay. As they waited for the doors to open, Barton knew he wouldn't let that happen. First, though, it was time to remember Ginger. Police funerals were strange things. Ginger had been far from popular. His biting wit had riled many, and he had possessed an ability to find a nickname for someone that shredded them. One such victim came to talk to Barton as they waited in the spring sunshine for the earlier service to finish. "Detective Barton, good to see you again." "Chief Superintendent Blake Lafferty, or may I call you Bloke, on such a day?" "Oh, you can call me whatever you like if you fancy 3 years in traffic afterwards." "They will bury your nickname with him, sir." Lafferty stared at him without expression before cracking a grin. "That cackling bastard pushed me to distraction. He drove me on, though. I wanted to get promoted so high I would never have to see his spotty face again." "Are you here to make sure he's gone?" "Not officially. I was visiting the station anyway, but I'll definitely be raising a glass to him later." Still a dick, thought Barton, as he laughed inside at the memories. Lafferty had irritated everyone from the very beginning. He had been desperate to climb the ladder, and his ruthless ambition had progressively worsened. One weekend, Ginger had altered his locker name card from Blake Lafferty to Bloke's Lavatory, and kept sticking home-drawn pictures of turds underneath it. For years, Lafferty had borne the brunt of puns about having stuff dumped on him. Nostalgia threatened to swamp Barton as he thought about jokes from 20 years ago. The crematorium doors opened, and he found Holly's hand in his. People often filled the seats at the rear first, like at weddings, but Barton strode to the front. Navneet Naeem, his old DCI, and her sons and husband joined him. The Snow Killer had damaged their lives too. Any staff that Thorpe Wood Police Station could spare filled the surrounding spaces, and the place was full. Barton couldn't see any strangers, and it was only when he stood to say his words that he recognised Ginger's ex-girlfriend Debbie standing at the back, in between DC's Whitlam and Malik. He placed his written notes to one side. He didn't need them. He spoke from the heart, even getting in a few toilet jokes just to upset Lafferty, until a subtle cough from the celebrant told him to wind it up. DC Alan Ginger Rogers won't be remembered as the best cop of the force has ever had. He won't go down as the most reliable person to work with either. Yet we solved many cases because of his intelligence and experience. I was proud to call him a colleague and a friend. I'm glad he became part of my life. He died a hero. Chapter 7. The Soul Killer. I returned to my mother's old property and lived with Barney after graduating from university. But I would often make excuses to leave the house or find myself wandering from room to room. My emotions were conflicted. Mother had truly believed in her actions as she had cocooned me from the world. She was dangerous, yet never deadly. Instead, it turned out that crossing me was her last mistake. But then she should never have touched my things. Any minor feelings of regret had long since faded. I struggled to find well-paid work in Wisbech. I worked in a bakery again for a while, but I wanted a serious job. The biggest city nearby was Peterborough. Shared living, like at university, did not appeal. I found a row of strange, tiny terraced houses along a decrepit dead-end track. One big bedroom upstairs and one large lounge diner downstairs sounds weird, but it made the place feel bigger than it was. Reasonable rent and plenty of parking near disused railway yards made it appealing, even though the dwellings did remind me a little of hobbits' homes with thin walls. Number 3 became mine, and apart from the bloke 2 doors away from me playing his music too loud, I loved it there. After finishing my studies and applying all over, I got my dream role. Shift work never bothered me, and I took advantage of any overtime. I thought of my mother often with a newfound appreciation. She wasn't the only one who thought this world was a practice ground for eternity and no rules applied. My job showed me the damage humans did to one another. People died, few cared, they were quickly forgotten. My job meant people held me in some esteem. It never failed to give me a buzz. I joined a running club, but didn't meet a new Charlie. Many of the members were much older than me, meaning I failed to settle. Instead, I bounced from gym to keep in shape. My body changed little despite my strength improving. Rarely did I arrive at a machine and need to lower a weight, but it seemed my muscles were fine as they were. That said, the world was changing, and so was what people found attractive. Celebrities ate little and exercised constantly. People admired that look. Long years passed, and I feared I'd never meet my soulmate. Sometimes I woke at night bathed in sweat, the point of life evading me. My thoughts strayed back to Charlie and the lecturer. It became a sore that I'd itch. I hated my history. All those people that had treated me badly and showed me disrespect tempered my enthusiasm for living. My past, left as it was, ruined my future. Dating websites gained in popularity at the time. Those internet pages seemed beyond the normal rules of society. You didn't need the dark web when you had social media in its present form. People assumed new identities, and the witless and feckless paid the price. I dabbled, but decided I would not meet my soulmate that way. However, I used Tinder mercilessly. When I was a young boy, no one wanted me. When I became an adult, finding out people had swiped right at my picture became an addictive pick-me-up. I chose normal individuals, having found the truly attractive people overconfident and mildly threatening. The meetings with them tended to make me feel angry as opposed to horny. I dated women until they slept with me. Sometimes that was for weeks, other times only minutes. Them wanting more fed my growing confidence. I would cut all ties after that first coupling. But it wouldn't be long until I searched for the next one, often because I needed someone else in my life. I felt sure I would know the moment I met someone perfect. It wouldn't be through a grubby hookup site. My mother said she knew the moment she met my father. It would be a chemical reaction. I suppose I expected a thunderbolt. The change began 18 months ago with a sense of being watched while browsing at the supermarket. I'm a man of routine, shifts permitting, so I guess it wouldn't have taken Claudia too long to work out when I shopped. Every Friday night, I bought one of those rotisserie chickens and chunks of gammon from the deli. I'd get a selection of fruit and vegetables, and that would last me the whole weekend. 2 weeks in a row, I came away with an itch between my shoulder blades. The next visit, I caught a young girl staring at me. I didn't recognise her, but the moment our eyes met, she smiled. A few seconds later, our trolleys bumped while she grinned up at me. "Hey, don't we know each other?" she asked. She was about 5 feet tall and pear-shaped. Faint freckles glistened on her red cheeks. Her tracksuit had damp patches under her arms, while unkempt hair hung heavily down her neck. "No, I don't believe so." Her attire disconcerted me, but it was her wide-eyed enthusiasm that made me step back. "I think I'd have remembered someone like you." "Very smooth. Are you chatting me up?" I'm just kidding. Although I am single. Look, they gave us these at work this week." I read the glossy business card embossed with Claudia Birtwistle, property lawyer. I shook my head. Name doesn't ring a bell. "You used to go to the Virgin gym." We flirted a little. Through the machines, but then you left before we spoke. "Give me a call. I see you're still in good shape. Where do you work out?" "I'm at the Holiday Inn Leisure Club. They installed new equipment, but haven't put the prices up yet." "Perhaps I'll check it out. We can grab a coffee now if you like." I didn't want to be rude, but I couldn't believe she was the person I had been waiting for. Regardless, the first date with my wife-to-be wouldn't happen in a Morrison's supermarket restaurant surrounded by feral toddlers and pushy pensioners. "I can't. I'm off to the gym now." "Have you just been to yours?" If her moistness wasn't through exertion, it could only be due to illness or drugs. "I've been to Boxercise. It's great." "Another time then?" She did that annoying pretend phone hand gesture as she backed away and mouthed, "Call me." I chuckled at the prospect, but as I wandered off, I realised the inane gesture was the only thing I'd found irritating. She wasn't especially pretty, but I detected none of the bitterness that drunken Charlie had been unable to keep out of every conversation. I was surprised to find that Claudia dominated my thoughts, and I almost rang her. I'd run imaginary calls through my mind, but always felt daft. Work distracted me, and soon the weekend came around again, the time for my weekly shop. I arrived in new jeans and my best shirt. She wasn't there. I dawdled like a fool in every aisle and clanged into other shoppers with my eyes on the horizon. Perhaps I'd read it wrong. Huge queues swarmed at the checkouts, and I nearly deserted the trolley in frustration. I joined the self-pay line, which moved faster, and waited with sagging shoulders. A stony-faced woman with a black ponytail turned round after I accidentally nudged her hip with my shopping. Mascara-darkened blue eyes drilled into mine. "I thought you were going to ring me," said Claudia. There it was. More lightning bolt than thunder.